So, I don't need to convince any of you that the US healthcare system, it just sucks ass. I mean, it's one of the few things everyone left, right, and center can pretty much agree on. But however much you think you know, I promise you that by the end of this story, you're never gonna see a simple doctor's visit the same again. Right, and so to kick this dive off, we're gonna start with one of the most controversial drugs in recent American history, Byal. And it's nothing more than two generic drugs combined into a single pill to treat congestive heart failure. It was invented back in the 80s by cardiologist J. Cohn, who ran trials, got a patent, and then took it to the pharmaceutical company Medco, which then sent it to the FDA for approval in 1997, but the agency rejected it. And that's even though most of the review panel said they thought that it was effective, but they said that the trials weren't designed to meet the agency's particular standards, meaning that if Medco just ran another trial, it could probably get Byal approved. But the thing with clinical trials is that they're very expensive, and by then, half the drug's patent life had already run out, so the company just handed the rights back to Cohn. Now the thing with that is, if he could market the drug to a specific subgroup instead of just the general population, then he could obtain a new patent. So Cohn, he starts sifting through the old data, and he notices that Byal, hey, it actually seems to work better for African Americans. But notably, there were only 49 black participants in the trial, so the sample size was just too small. So Cohn, he patents Byal again, he takes it to a different company, Nitromed, and conducts a new trial, this time with only black patients. And the drug seemed to work, but there was one big problem. They didn't gather any data to see if it also worked on white patients. So the core selling point of the drug that he was going for, right, that it's specifically for black people, it was never actually proven. But Nitromed, they only needed to prove that the drug was at least good enough to treat whatever population it marketed for. So that's how in 2005, Byal actually became the first drug ever approved by the FDA exclusively for a single racial group, which was one small step forward for Nitromed, but one giant leap backward for American medicine, right? Because immediately the news got picked up by major newspapers across the country that ran headlines touting Byal as a drug for black people, effectively lending government and media credibility to the idea that race is a biologically meaningful category. But as geneticists have known for decades, it's just simply not.
I think the reason this is a problem is it's grounded in bad science.
So that is Harvard resident Dr. Rohan Kazanchi.
So there's actually more genetic variation within racial groups than there is between racial groups.
And he says that race, it's an imprecise category, not only because it's an extremely poor predictor of genetics, but also because it's so fluid. Right? Many people identify as mixed race, others change their racial identification over time, and the racial categories themselves, they change from census to census, which is why Dr. Neil Schluger, a professor at the New York Medical College, says that race is entirely a social construct.
The differences that we assign to racial characteristics, skin color, hair texture, shape of someone's eyes or something like that are really not much more meaningful than differences in hair color.
Yet, as the case of Byal shows, the myth of biological race continued to plague parts of the medical field well into the 21st century. But what I want to show you here is that this ugly idea, what Kazanchi calls
racial essentialism,
it goes so much deeper and further than Byal in ways that not even all doctors are aware of. I mean, let's take, for example, your lungs. If you go to the doctor to get those things tested, they'll often have you blow into a device called a spirometer. They'll then plug the data into an equation along with a bunch of other information about age, weight, and sex to see if you have healthy lungs. But what you might not realize is that one of the inputs for that equation is your race. And to understand why, we have to go back to the 1970s.
It was noticed that for any given age, height, and sex, that Black individuals had lower levels of lung function than whites. And that was just assumed to be normal biology.
Though of course, differences in lung health could probably be explained by a host of other factors tied not to race, but racism.
Economic status, educational status, environmental exposures, access to good nutrition.
But the people designing the equations, they didn't think about any of that. So they just figured it made sense to adjust the score up or down depending on the patient's race. Meaning you could take two patients, one black, one white, who are completely identical except for their skin color. And when you test them, the equation says that the white patient has lung disease while the black one doesn't. Basically telling the black patient, your lungs are pretty weak, but they're not bad for a black person. And while the medical community really only moved away to de-racialize lung function testing a few years ago, I mean, race is still used for it in many, many hospitals to this day. And so as you might expect, it leads to a lot of black people getting fewer diagnoses, lower doses for prescription drugs, and fewer referrals to a specialist. And so to actually try to quantify the effects of all this, a team of researchers, including Kazanchi, they conducted a study. With them taking a sample of nearly 400,000 people and extrapolating the data out to represent 250 million Americans. And they asked a simple question. If we test these people with a race-neutral equation instead of the traditional one, how different will the results be? What they found was absolutely shocking.
Many people would be reclassified. So ventilatory impairment for 12.5 million people, medical impairment ratings may be reclassified for 8.16 million, occupational eligibility for over 2 million, breeding of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD for over 2 million, and military disability compensation for 413,000.
I mean, we're talking about disability payments that are increasing on the order of thousands of dollars annually and redistributing over $1 billion in disability payments to eligible veterans. With the study's lead author, James Byal, adding there,
almost 90% of the lung transplant waiting list in 2020 would have been rearranged or given some other priority if we had not used race back then.
And while Black patients are definitely impacted the most by race-adjusted equations, all racial groups, even including white people, they feel the effects.
The use of race in these equations made Black patients look less sick and made white patients look sicker.
So some white people, they experience the opposite problem of getting overdiagnosed. And sometimes, because nowadays the equations are done automatically through an algorithm in the machine, even doctors themselves don't know race is influencing the numbers. But, and this is where things get really scary, all of this goes far beyond just lung function tests. Right, going back to congestive heart failure, an equation that predicts your risk of death from that is also race adjusted. And then, you've also got race being factored into equations for the risk of death from complications during cardiac surgery, the risk that an organ transplant's gonna fail, the risk of complications during vaginal birth for someone who's had a prior C-section. And the list of things, it just goes on and on. Kidney disease, kidney stones, UTIs, osteoporosis, cancer, diabetes, on and on. Hell, even the tests that modeled cognitive functioning for NFL players who sued the league for concussive injuries, they used race as a crude proxy for social factors and life experience.
I think the unfortunate reality is that there are examples of race-based medicine that impact nearly every organ system in the body.
But interestingly enough, the murder of George Floyd prompted a sudden reckoning in just about every corner of American life, and that includes medicine, with the American Medical Association passing a resolution that fall condemning racial essentialism, as well as calling for a stop to using race as a proxy for biology or genetics in medical education, research, and clinical practice. Then in 2021, we saw the American Thoracic Society and European Respiratory Society renounce race-adjusted lung function testing. And in 2022, the Global Lung Function Initiative created a race-neutral equation for testing. So at this point, you're thinking, okay, well, that's it, right? We did it. We fixed the problem. There's no reason Phil should be talking about this. Well, as it turns out, correcting the historical legacy of racism, not the easiest thing, because just changing the guidelines, it doesn't automatically change what's happening on the ground.
Sometimes we talk about this 30-year delay from when something becomes standard of care to when it becomes, widespread clinical practice.
Right. We can see this delay in one of the other big examples of race-adjusted testing, kidney function.
There was a study that found that when there's a new equation that was recommended for kidney function, after 10 years, only a quarter of testing laboratories has switched to the new equation.
Right now, he says, we don't have any concrete data on how many hospitals have and haven't made the switch to race-neutral equations. And so if your doctor asks for your race while filling out paperwork or punching numbers into a calculator, that might be a good time to ask some probing questions. Which, to be clear, it doesn't mean get ridiculous and start yelling about how you're gonna call your lawyer. Though, if you think that you may have received substandard care because of race-based medicine, lawsuits are an effective way to apply pressure on institutions to change their practices. But rather, just ask how race might affect your care, and depending on their answer, it either clears up your concerns or it starts a useful conversation. Ideally, that's how it plays out.